All right. Hello, my name is Emily and welcome back to my channel. Tonight we're going to be talking about The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham. If you're here on the live or if you're here on the replay, let me know your thoughts on this in the comments down below. Did you like this book? What did you think of this book? So, while we maybe give folks a minute to roll in, I just wanted to give a couple of disclaimers and warnings. So the whole premise of this book involves something not of this world, implanting people with wombs with parasite children, like brood parasite birds do, like cuckoo birds. And we will be discussing this with the language of sexual assault later on. We will also be discussing characters that are pregnant, the complete lack of an abortion as a thought that crosses anyone's mind on page, and also miscarriage and suicide. I think those are the big ones. So if there is, I guess, anything that you're not ready to listen to or to think about this evening, please take care of yourself. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is the language of this book. So this book was published in 1957. It's an interesting, meaty, moral book. It asks a lot of questions about humanness and ethics and rights, the rights that we have. So I am going to try and use contemporary language where possible. So I think in 2022, we can acknowledge that biological sex and gender identity are different things, separate things. The language and the thinking of when this was written and published is not there. And it does equate gender and sex. So I'm going to try my best to use inclusive language where possible. But I'm also going to use the language of this book. So it's going to be a little messy. Just wanted to put that out there. Okay. Disclaimers aside, if you have read this book, I would love to know what you thought of it. Any thoughts on any other John Wyndham books? This, I think, is my third John Wyndham. Which ones have I done? Triffids, Cuckoos, The Kraken Wakes, and I read The Chrysalids a very long time ago. I don't know if that counts because I don't really remember it. But what I am appreciating about these books is that they are a little bit older, but they are all asking questions that I feel like are still really relevant now. I wasn't really expecting this. My cover is a terrible, nobody was thinking about Instagram or sharing this on TikTok when this cover was put together. It's an ugly cover, and I had no idea really what I was expecting, but I had no idea what to expect, right? But I really wasn't expecting to think about how relevant, the overturning of Roe v. Wade recently was while reading this book. So I like that this is still relevant. It still feels like a powerful read, even though it's quite a bit older than some of our more contemporary issue-based sci-fi, I guess. I've divided this up a little bit oddly, and things will come back in different sections. So we are going to stay a little bit non-spoilery for this first bit. So we're going to start with the chunk that is fair game for this non-spoilery or light spoilery part. So we're looking at a town called Midwich. that for 24 hours is cut off from the rest of the world. It's this like middle of nowhere town. And anyone who tries to enter into this like dome that's been set up, they fall immediately unconscious. And our narrative point of view is a husband and wife duo named Janet and Richard Gayford. And they're traveling. They find themselves outside the barrier and they're like, well, we'll just try and sneak in. And Janet falls unconscious, but she ends up being pulled out. And so she is not somebody who ends up experiencing what the rest of the town does during what they come to call the day out. Then as suddenly as the barrier appears, it disappears. And everything appears unchanged by this event. That is until all of the women of childbearing age discover that they are pregnant. And to try and get ahead of the panic that this might cause, because some of these are unmarried women who are not sexually active, or very young women who are not sexually active, the doctor and vicar try and get ahead of any sort of panic, and they approach who I'm thinking of as like a local academic, Gordon Zellaby. And they want to use Gordon Zellaby's also pregnant wife, Angela Zellaby, as their mouthpiece to really shape the narrative that is happening. And so on the one hand, you have this like self-appointed committee in town shaping the narrative and guiding this, how I guess this mass, it's not fertilization, it's a mass implantation, how this is being handled. And then the military is also involved. So military intelligence is sort of keeping an eye on this situation. And then in this section, I guess the babies are also fair game, the fast-growing, fast-learning, golden-eyed babies. A little bit is fair game for this section, and we start to get some moral and ethical questions that arise. And so for the light spoiler section, we could talk about the title, The Midwich Cuckoos. I've had this book for a long time. I always thought it was a weird title. Not knowing that cuckoos are a type of brood parasite. So brood parasites exist in the natural world, and they rely on others to raise their young. And so oftentimes they manipulate the host by egg mimicry, and then the parasitic parents don't have to expend energy raising their young. Somebody else does that. And, the benefit is the futuring of the parasitic species with little to no effort. And so you end up with what somebody described as an evolutionary arms race between the parasite and the host as they co-evolve alongside each other. And I found a video from Z Frank. I will try and actually, you know what? I could do it right now. I could post it in the chat for anyone's perusal. Hi, Lydia. So this video shows some of the examples that I thought was really interesting for how like the host species will like evolve to put little spots on their eggs, and then the parasite species somehow manages to evolve to put similar spots on the eggs so that the host parent can't even tell the difference and like kick the egg out. So it's an interesting bit of evolution that exists. And I like how it comes into play with the title. But if we think about this, this brings up one of those moral, ethical issues that I think the book asks us to think about. So at first glance, we could say that yes, these children are brood parasite offspring. These not human, something other than human, has chosen select human populations to incubate, to grow, and to bear, and to raise their young. So it's humans who now have to put in the time, money, and energy to raise these, I'm going to call them alien babies. The book, I don't think, ever fully comes down on what these are, but they are not human. So like on the surface, you're like, yeah, okay, that works. It's kind of like what cuckoo birds do. But the difference really is in the laying of eggs. So brood parasites, whether they're birds or insects, lay eggs, and the host parents have an opportunity to like look at these things in their nest and be like, hang on, there are too many here. This one's bigger. This one has spots. This one doesn't have spots, and they can huck it out of their nest. That does not happen for the human women because we don't lay eggs, and right, like it takes a long time for people who can become pregnant to even realize they're pregnant. And if that's not a desired state of being, it's not as simple as tossing an egg out of a nest and that's the end of it. Physically and emotionally, humans have a lot more moral and ethical questions and laws. Birds don't have that. Insects don't have that. So in some ways it feels like it, by thinking of these kids as like brood parasites, as cuckoos, instead of human children, it feels a little bit like it minimizes what happens to the women in Midwich, which is it's an assault. It like they were put unconscious. This was placed into them, this like pre-assembled, however this alien species reproduces, this pre-fertilized, pre-assembled thing was put inside human women to incubate without their consent, without their knowledge, and that it isn't the same as laying an egg in a nest. It's, I don't know. Okay, so the other part that I'm thinking about is this maybe a reflection of the knowledge around female reproduction and that functioning? Historically, there's been like a lot of poor science around women, female people. I guess I should say people assigned female at birth. So because this was written and published in the 1950s, we're not looking at the first successful live birth from in vitro fertilization until 1978. So Wyndham is sort of playing with like future technology. Like I assume that this is a thing that science or medicine was thinking about, but hadn't been able to do up until many years after this book was written. And yes, I am also curious. That's a good question. So Lydia in the chat has mentioned that how would it differ with today's technology with ultrasounds? I think you can do genetic screening. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, what would a modern like pregnancy checkup look like for the women of Midwich? Like it is very rooted in where we're at in terms of reproductive technology and knowledge. So I guess the thing that I'm one of the things that, that I ended up delving into for this is what goes into IVF. All of the hormones that have to go into a body to make an implantation succeed. And because this is like a far future technology from when Wyndham is writing, like, we know now that it would be very unlikely for all of the women of Midwich that are of reproductive age to successfully have a live birth at the end of this. The statistic I saw from the Mayo Clinic said that miscarriage rates for IVF are somewhere between 15 and 25%. And like on top of that, miscarriage is a touchy topic. I feel like it's really only been with like my generation of people that are like very publicly posting their lives on the internet, being like, this is a thing and it's very common. It feels kind of right that maybe a man like John Wyndham is writing in the 1950s to not know how like fanciful it would be for 60 to 70 women implanted with the alien bebés to have like 100% success rate. And so I feel like this is one of the places where we really feel the absence of women's voices in the text. Like they're there. They're there, but it's always men talking about them. And this is something I'm going to bring up over and over again. It's in this case, right? Like with this lived experience, like if we put the future technology aside, the only people witnessing these losses, or the only way, I guess, that the men in the town who are telling us the story can witness this loss is through the suicides of the unmarried women, or the suicide attempts of the unmarried women who couldn't deal with waking up pregnant, and the baggage of being an unwed single mother in the 1950s. Also, the doctor is looking at a certain range of humans, sort of, I assume, assessing from the outside who looks to be of reproductive age. With IVF technology, older people with uteruses can become pregnant. However, as maternal age increases, the chance of miscarriage increases. So some of the people that the doctor sort of writes off as like old maids could have been implanted on the day out and miscarried and have this like secret, this like not participating in their statistics. And it's just there. It just feels like such an absence. And we see secondhand accounts for the women always, right? And yes, they are hysterical. This I think is one of the ways that the women are reported as hysterical. It's this quotation where Farrelyn Zellaby, who is Mr. Zellaby's daughter, who is like unwed, presumably has not done the things to get pregnant. She writes this, quote, not very coherent letter. And it intimated, so it doesn't state, it intimates that she did not see how it could be, and in fact, according to all she had learned, it couldn't be, so she did not understand it at all, but the fact was, in some mysterious way, she seemed to have started a baby on page 54. So not only is this a letter that somebody, so the woman who is experiencing it has written this letter, somebody else has read it, and then they have told our narrator, who appears to be Richard Gayford, and Richard Gayford is telling this to us. So we have this passing of information, which I feel like is kind of in it has to be a deliberate choice. I feel like as we move through this, we have to see that this absence is deliberate, I think. Otherwise, I don't know. I feel like I'm going to be really upset. Like, there are ways to have written this book, like multiple points of view. It's a thing. We could have had multiple narrative points of view, but we don't do that. We could have had the more scrapbook style of storytelling that Stephen King is really well known for. Like, if we think about Carrie, parts of Carrie are like court cases, like typed out. They're newspapers. They are firsthand accounts of what Carrie is experiencing. They're people, like other points of view, remembering a situation. Like, we're given so many points of view of one situation. And like, that could have been a way to include the Midwich women's voices in this text, but it's not. And again, there's language in the text that indicates that we're never hearing a firsthand account. So, quote, "In point of fact, investigations have shown that Alan was not the first to hear Farrellan's news." So investigation is the word that I want to focus on. So again, somebody else has done that investigating, and it's being reported to us. We also have 2 attempted suicides. And it's with these suicides that the men sort of decide they have to do something. And I think it's interesting because we have no discussion of abortion in this text. So there are no miscarriages, and there are no miscarriages, if we want to put like scare quotes around that. While it might not have been medically, YouTube's going to hate this video. There should be no monetization on this. It might not be medically available. Like, Dr. Willers is probably not performing them. And, you know, it's probably not legal, even if he was to perform an abortion. But I feel like there is a long history of people who can get pregnant doing things to prevent that or to stop that, sometimes quite dangerously, sometimes using, you know, the old wives' tales, folk remedies. They all came from somewhere. And I think we see evidence of that in the text, but it's not explicitly named that. And again, because we have the distance of this being a man narrating it to us, at first glance, this reads like a weird list of women being hysterical, as Lydia has pointed out. But I wonder if we could read this as women attempting to have agency over the situation. So the bit that I'm talking about is there's one not so young woman who suddenly bought a bicycle and pedaled it madly for astonishing distances with fierce determination. 2 young women collapsed in over hot baths. 3 inexplicably tripped and fell down the stairs. Those scare quotes around that are mine. And a number suffered from unusual gastric upsets on page 60. So the way that this is read to us is the narrator going, golly gee, the women started acting weird. But if we read between the lines, I feel like you always see in older books, pregnant women or pregnant people are described as in delicate condition, you know? Oh, you can't move around too much. Modern medicine says otherwise. So maybe this vigorous exercise, this woman suddenly becoming like an extreme cyclist, is an attempt to rid herself of this delicate condition. We have women who have tripped and fell down the stairs. I mean, sure, it's very convenient. And then gastric upset. What strange things are the women of Midwich eating and drinking that cause all of these tummy troubles. And part of me wonders if this lack in the text, this silence, this absence in the text is because of the larger censorship issues happening. So like I just sort of joked that YouTube is going to hate this because of everything that I've talked about so far, right? Like in 2022, rape, sexual assault, abortion, reproductive rights, medicine on people assigned female at birth, miscarriage, motherhood, being child-free by choice. Like these are all difficult subjects that are not advertiser friendly, and they were also difficult subjects in the 1950s. And so I stumbled across an academic and a dramatist named Dan Rebellato. Oh, anyway I say it, it sounds ugly, but the name looks quite pretty. It looks like it should roll. And so this person ended up adapting Wyndham's novel for the stage. And they feel like that there is a subtle subtext in the novel. And in the 1950s, under Lord Chamberlain's censorship for obscenity, you couldn't openly talk about this. And so he argues that Wyndham is using misdirection, subtext, irony, and ambiguity in order to allow this book to be published. So it's, on the surface, appears kind of like a wacky alien novel that's going to get philosophical in the back half. But what is between the lines is sort of what I'm picking at here, like reproductive rights, right? You can't state it explicitly, but they're there. And I feel like further supporting this are some of the literary references that Wyndham brings in. So on the one hand, you have, I guess not on one hand, erase that. You have the military doing this cover-up story, right? And they want to keep it from the paper, and the colonel says something to the effect of like, well, I guess this story, if we can contain it, it depends on how interesting Sleeping Beauty is to the people. Like, is it a sensation or a bore? And I mean, it turns out that the story ends up being not interesting because the people just slept and woke up seemingly unchanged. But the whole idea of this Sleeping Beauty reference, it's later described as having a dreamlike quality. It really reminds me of Giambattista Basile's Sun, Moon, and Talia. So this is an early Sleeping Beauty story variation in which a woman named Talia, she's endangered from a splinter of flax. And of course, like all Sleeping Beauty tales, she somehow ends up with that splinter of flax in her finger, and she falls into a deep sleep. And I believe her father leaves her on the throne, not in like a tower. So she's just chilling. And a prince comes in and he finds Talia. And I believe the story uses the phrase that he fathers the fruits of love, gross, while she's asleep. And then also while asleep, Talia grows and gives birth to twins, and in her sleep. And one of the twins starts sucking on her finger and sucks the splinter of flax out. And Talia wakes up to discover that she is now a mother, and she has no idea how that happened. I just, it's such a similar situation to call that out. Yeah, it is wild that Disney has sanitized this so much. this is a dark version of the Sleeping Beauty tale. I believe it predates the Grimm brothers too, who also love to get kind of dark and gritty. But yeah, I feel like we understand that what the prince did, putting the fruits of his love into an unconscious person, is wrong. And drawing that parallel to what has happened in the text, like I think we're really invited to think about this as something like gross, something dark and despicable. And again, I think as a fairy tale is probably supposed to be a reference that a lot of readers will get without explicitly stating the women of Midwich were raped by aliens, right? We could just be like, oh, those sleeping beauties, and sort of invite that comparison without getting censored. The other literary reference, hey Leo, the other literary reference I think we can't ignore is obviously biblical. And I thank you for watching. Thank you for coming back and for checking this out. I feel like we can't ignore the Immaculate Conception, right? Like the biblical story, even more probably widely known than the dark version of Sleeping Beauty, is the Virgin Mary's magic pregnancy. And I mean, I always find it interesting whenever something like this happens in literature. We play with that biblical connection. But then nobody in the modern context is willing to believe that a miracle has happened, right? So like even the women in this book, we have Farrellyn talking to Angela, and she's like, oh, you know, I seem to be pregnant. And her mother figure, Angela, is like, yeah, that's okay. Like, we'll have to get you married and stuff. And Farrellyn goes, you don't understand, Angela. It isn't that. It wasn't anybody. That's why I'm frightened. And that's on page 59. So you have this, like, there is a narrative for this. There is a literary or historical, if you are in a group that takes the Bible as like literal, context for this, but no one believes it when it's you, right? No one believes it when it's the woman next door who's like, it wasn't anybody. And like the vicar finds this too. So like a lot of girls go to the vicar, who is a religious figure in the community. You would think if anybody, he would be more likely to believe this. And he's like, all of them, good, intelligent, and certainly not ignorant girls. Yet each of them told me it wasn't anybody, and that's why I'm frightened. And then these, like, it's described as inexplicable, as incomprehensible. I find it interesting that it isn't taken as a religious miracle, that it is very much, the science lens is very much turned on it, right? And the one person who takes it as a religious warning, not a miracle, right? So the vicar's wife, who also has no name. So many of these women don't have names. There's a woman who, I'm going to totally tangent. There's a woman who attempts to die by suicide, Mrs. Dory. So Tom Dory's nameless wife downs a bottle of aspirin, and she doesn't even get a name. Like, yeah, okay. Anyways, Mrs. Leebody, who apparently has no first name that I could find, if she has one, it isn't mentioned more than once. She's a religious person. And instead of interpreting these inexplicable pregnancies as miracles, she interprets it as punishment. She interprets it as she's been barren for 12 years and like getting pregnant now amongst all of these other people. It must be that she's sinned in some way, and it's punishment from God that she has to bear a child that isn't her husband's. And she actually goes over to the next town, train, and starts preaching. And I think it's the vicar or minister there who's like, hey, your wife is preaching about like wrath and retribution and hellfire, and believes that Midwich has fallen under this like divine disapproval. Like, is she okay? So they think framing this as a biblical plague of babies is wacky and unhinged. So it's one of those references that I feel like the Virgin Mary, it's one of those references that we can't help but think about. And then the text goes, no, no, not at all. Like, nobody is going to accept this as a miracle. So still within like the light spoilers area, I want to talk about women and the representation of women. And I'm curious how folks felt about the women in this text, if there were any female characters or women characters that stand out as being, how do I want to phrase this? Like acting with agency. Yeah. Well, I'll challenge you to that. Find me a lady character who feels okay, like you feel okay with in 2022. So the one thing that stood out when I was looking at this, I also looked at some Goodreads reviews to see what people thought. And there was a reviewer who said, the only way this book could be better is if more voice was given to female characters. The setup, where all the discussion around health and well-being of pregnant women is conducted by men, reminds me of the modern-day abortion-related discourse in the media. And I feel like, yes, it's just, this worked out to be particularly, I guess, on the nose in 2022. Yeah. So Lydia in the chat has mentioned that it feels like Wyndham wrote all of the women as hysterical messes. The narrator's wife was mostly solid, although she had barely any presence. Yes, agreed. And she actually gets deliberately left out of the second half. Like, she's here in the first half, and then we get to part 2. It's like 9 years later, and they're on vacation, but they go their separate ways. And then he ends up stuck in Midwich, and she's like dicking around the countryside. Like, she never comes back. Why? Like, she was one of the only, I guess, women who is of childbearing age who could have been in this position because they lived in Midwich. They just happened to not be home that day. The one character that I feel really bad for is Angela Zellaby. It's the men of the town, this like self-appointed committee of Dr. Willers, Vicar Leebody, and Mr. Zellaby. They choose her as the mouthpiece, seemingly because they feel like they can control her. And so they gather all of the women together in this like town hall situation, and they've decided what they think is happening. They've decided what Angela is allowed to say, and they use her to shape the narrative, to give the women just enough information, but not too much that they might get their own ideas and do different things. And then later we find out, like after she gets off the stage, she's talking to her husband, Gordon Zellaby, and she goes, "You know, it isn't true, Gordon, what I said just now about being glad and happy. I wanted the baby, yours and mine, so very much. Now I'm quite frightened about it," on page 73. Like we know that she's not okay with this, but they just sort of, they use her. And like there are so many points where I feel like we're going to talk about the men next and how the men are involved in this and shaping this. There are many opportunities to, I think, have shifted the whole situation of this narrative arc. If they had just talked to the women who were impacted by it. Yeah. So the men in this book, we have a military cover-up. And I hate to say it, but the military is a pretty male-dominated space. They're deciding that they want to keep this quiet. They want to keep it in this small town, that the women don't really have an opportunity to go public with this, to get larger support from other communities about what to do. Like, even if one of these women who hears Angela talk wants to go get a second opinion, wants to go tell people, like, hey, this happened and I don't think what's happening here is right. Like, there has been a real movement to squash getting anyone else involved who might support the women of Midwich or advocate for them differently. Keeping in mind also that this is a small town. Like, they describe Midwich as like basically the middle of fucking nowhere. They're like, they're not even sure. There's a line somewhere about they're not even sure why this was a town. Like, there's nothing here, like no river, no industry, no nothing. Like, why did this village pop up? They don't know. Like, that's how isolated this small town is. They don't have their own hospital, right? Like, it is small. And so I wonder if it was a larger space, if there would have been more people to advocate differently, more people who are maybe a little bit more liberal. I don't know. But yeah, that's squashed by the military cover-up. Bernard actually, so Bernard is the colonel, he describes wanting a report on the state of health, mind, and morale so that he can keep a fatherly eye on Midwich. Fatherly, he has this patriarchal, he's the patriarch watching over Midwich, the idea that he has this paternal interest, it just rubs me the wrong way. We find out later, spoilers, that he knows more than he's letting on. So him being like, oh, I just have this fatherly interest, a caring interest, right? It's gross. It feels icky. The men also talk at length about how they have to stop the unmarried women from going neurotic, the book's words. And to do that, they have to upset the married women. So at this point in the book, the married women are all like, oh, well, I have a legitimate reason to be pregnant because I have a husband and we do the sex. So this isn't weird that we're all pregnant at the same time. And so the men decide that they are going to sacrifice the happiness of some women for the happiness of other women. And then Zellaby says, one thing that's been worrying me all evening is how much we ought to tell them. Should we leave the thing a mystery and let them draw conclusions eventually for themselves on page 63? And like all of this reads as so fucking patronizing. Like none of these women have brains in their heads. It also sort of thinks of these women, again, we go back to like poor knowledge of women's reproductive health. It goes back to the idea that like this is the like first child ever for any of these women, that none of them have figured out that there is some like cycle and flow to fertility, and that they might be a little bit suspicious of why this happened. I don't know, just like that, the way that the men talk about the situation is obnoxious. It's absolutely obnoxious. And like they feel so smug that they've gleaned what they think the women are experiencing. And they feel like they have the right to hold these theories and control what happens next when they are not personally impacted by it. And then like they decide scientifically with their, you know, thinky man powers and their knowledge, they decide that it's exogenesis, that the women are likely hosts. And Dr. Willers frowns and says, I've been hoping that that might not occur to them. And Zellaby goes, the intelligent ones are bound to arrive at this conclusion before long. It's just, it never reads as good. It never reads as good. Oh. And like, they talk about how they want to control this narrative for as long as they can. And Zellaby thinks that they have a case for what he feels is benign censorship. And then there's this one paragraph that just like, I ended up typing in like all caps after this. It just feels so ridiculous. He says, quote, it is difficult to appreciate how a woman sees these matters. All that I can say is that if I were to be called upon, even in the most propitious circumstances, to bring forth life, the prospect would awe me considerably. Had I any reason to suspect that it might be some unexpected form of life, I should probably go quite mad. Most women wouldn't, of course, they are mentally tougher, but some might, so a convincing dismissal of the possibility will be best on page 65. Like, just fuck off. Just fuck off, Zellaby. So, like, the first sentence there, it's like, you could see him say it. You could see him say it. It's difficult to appreciate how a woman sees these matters. Maybe you should fucking ask one, right? Like, just ask one. And then he's like, if I got pregnant, if that was something I could do, it would awe me considerably. It just, God, he feels like such a dipshit. Like he presents himself like such an educated man. And sorry, I do see Aditya in the comments has mentioned that every book has real estate for developing characters. I feel like these are some of the characters. Like these are, in some ways, they almost feel like caricatures. Like I'm getting so mad just pulling apart Zellaby's words that I feel like are deliberately crafted to make him look like one of these policy-making asshats, that their words and their actions have real-life consequences, but not for them, right? The whole like, would I be able to bring forth life? It would be fantastic. Therefore, all of these women should have to have these babies, right? It's just, he's so flat. He's such the like lofty academic. It has to be deliberate, right? Like if you were well-rounded, this wouldn't work. And it's the idea that they tell Angela that the narrative that they want the women to buy into is that babies are a joy and fun, and that the women need to band together. And like, they even admit it, like, having a baby is hard. It's hard work. And you know who needs the extra support right now is the single women. They need our sympathy and care at this time, on page 71. Like, the men can, on the one hand, acknowledge that, like, this is going to be a difficult thing. This is a difficult thing for people who want it, who try for it, who plan for it. So it's going to be extra hard for people who didn't. But at the end of the day, a baby is a joy. Babies are fun. And it just feels very, very pro-life. And I don't even know, like, I did not look at Wyndham's politics at all. I am purely looking at this text. In some ways, the first half of this book feels like recklessly pro-life. And then when we get to the ending, I think there's a pretty hard pivot. We're not going to talk about the ending quite yet, but there's a pretty hard pivot that maybe makes us question this. Yeah. I mean, the thing that I find, like, just keeps coming up with each of these, like, instances is over and over, the men are like, we're pretty sure this isn't human. Like, it might not be biblical. It might not be the next Jesus's. But like, there's like maybe a sick curiosity to see what will happen, to see what will be birthed for the science, right? And they seem to be manipulating the social expectation that women should be mothers, that women should want to have babies and fill that role, and almost guilt tripping the women into this being the choice. And we have another, like, secondhand account. This is the closest we get to seeing how the women are maybe feeling. And that is Angela Zellaby, who on page 87, she has had this little outburst to Gordon, and Gordon reports it back to his friends, and the narrator reports it to us. And so Angela talks about how he doesn't get it. He doesn't have to go through this sort of thing. The humiliating knowledge that one is simply being used. So the women of Midwich are aware that they are being used as just a kind of mechanism or incubator. She talks about being forced to incubate, and how it's degrading and intolerable. And so we don't, again, hear Angela say this in her own voice. We have this reported several times removed to us as readers. We see her give the speech to the women. We see her be the voice piece of the men. Presumably Janet is in that meeting hall. She is the witness to Angela's words. And that's how we as the reader are seeing this, because Janet's sort of our other narrative perspective. So we get, when the men are directing the words coming out of Angela's mouth, we get a closer view of it. When Angela is actually saying something that really matters, that is her own feeling on the situation, it's mediated. We're not witnessing her having this conversation. We're hearing about her having this conversation. And it happens over and over. Like, there are so many moments in this first half of the book where anyone who has real feelings, it's a mediated thing. It's not something that we bear witness to. And like, I think the men also know, right? Zellaby says the fact remains that however the girl takes it, she has been robbed. She has been swept suddenly from childhood into womanhood. And he finds that saddening. No chance to stretch her wings. She has to miss the age of true poetry. 92. Like the pretentious asshat that he is, he's like, oh, sad. Moving on. Everybody's having these babies. So, yeah. I feel like now that I've sort of ranted about this, it's time to look at life once the children have arrived. We're going to move into slightly more spoilery stuff. So let's just check in with the chat here. Ditya, do you think that hearsay distorts the presence of characters? I think so. I feel like once we start getting into the narrator mediating the conversation, that we have an opportunity for some, I guess, unreliability, perhaps. And I mean, I know an unreliable narrator is a thing that is done deliberately. And I almost wonder if that is, again, I don't think it's an accident. I don't think it is an accident that the women's voices have been deliberately left out. I think this text is too smart for that. I think it has been done very intentionally to have our narrative point of view, who is telling us what is happening, who is shaping the narrative in Midwich, and who is shaping the narrative that we see, is men on an issue that they are like wholly not qualified to talk about. Like, it's not happening. Being a host to a brood parasite is not happening to any of the men in this text. Right? Like, I think it speaks to, again, the real life situation that, like, who has the power to make laws is often not affected by them, right? Like, in this way, I feel like it's really smart. It's really clever that the text is leaving the women's voices out. And at the same time, I'm sitting here like, just fucking ask a woman. Ask one of the pregnant people in town what they think, what they would like to do. So yeah. Okay, we're going to talk about now that the children have arrived. So one of the first things that we see is, I think it's Mr. Zellaby, is like walking around town, and this like exhausted mother just like whips out a tit in public to breastfeed. And he's like, oh, I guess, I mean, babies, right? And she says, you'd understand if yours was one of the day out babies, on page 94. Like, so she's done this. Again, breastfeeding is one of those touchy issues about like whether or not it should be done in public, breasts as sexual objects versus, not objects, I guess sexual body parts versus like a food providing body part on somebody who is breastfeeding. Right? It's an odd thing to have this woman do something like that in public. And it's like one of the first hints that we get that the women are once again not in control. This is followed up by Farrellyn, who got married and had the baby out of town. She doesn't live in Midwich with her husband. And all of a sudden, she just shows up and she says, "He made me come." Like, she had no choice. And the men who keep hearing these reports of the women feeling compelled to do things by their baby, write it off. And they're putting together this report, and Janet insists that this go in the report. She insists that military intelligence knows that these babies have the ability to compel people. And the doctor is just like, it's a form of hysteria giving rise to collective hallucinations, which, again, is a very typical medical response to women going in with issues. Historically, even invoking hysteria as a thing, like a medical thing, that has a lot of baggage in sort of writing off women's mental health issues. And then Janet goes on to say, like, I've talked to these women, like, I've been asking around, and all of the mothers say that the babies can exert a form of compulsion. They all say that, like, they suddenly become aware of this feeling of distress that they only can relieve by doing what the baby wants. And it's interesting that the only person who has bothered to talk to the women and who believes them is a woman. The doctor pulls out a bunch of, like, psychology mumbo jumbo about, like, oh, like the experience of getting pregnant was abnormal, and then the pregnancy was abnormal, and then the babies are abnormal. So of course the women are going to start becoming deluded that their babies aren't normal and have special powers. It's, I don't know, again, it's very insulting, but it also speaks to the the experience of being a woman navigating the health system. Like, if you have ever talked to a woman who has tried to get healthcare, you have probably heard some of the horror stories. I think my favorite is one of my friends who in university was, like, super, super sick with mono, went in and they tried to prescribe her birth control for heavy periods. And they were like, that's like, we'll just manage your, like, period symptoms that don't look anything like mono with birth control. And, like, they completely wrote off, like, it's stupid stuff like that. You're like, how can that happen? And then you watch it happen again and again. And I feel like that's what we're seeing here now. Like, the women are like, this is really happening. And he's like, well, psychology. I have the medical degree. I think the other thing worth noting is that at this point, Zellaby starts to sing a different song. So at first, Zellaby seems to be a little bit like, ooh, curious, like, the scholar has an interest in what's going to become of this. And then he starts thinking of the women as victims of an imposition, and to think of the women as animals, almost like brood animals. He calls them, or he calls to mind, like, veterinary medicine. And in veterinarianism, is that a word? If you were to want to breed something, you would put it in a host mother. And he talks about this on page 106. And so here it's sort of, again, it didn't happen to him. He didn't get pregnant. He didn't have to have the baby. But now he's sort of seeing it. And he's like, oh, like, these women are kind of like animals. We've kind of treated them like animals, breeding things. And you're like, thank you, Zellaby. Like, we got that. Um, I think the other thing that sort of we really get a look into once the children are born is motherhood and the role of mother, what is expected of mother, and how much that plays into, I guess, the women allowing the male committee's narrative to take hold. And so, again, we have Alan talking to Gordon Zellaby about his wife, Farrellyn. And so Alan is like, in spite of the way it happened, Farrellyn does have a maternal feeling for it. He calls their baby it. Well, a sort of physical affection and a sense of obligation. But of course, that's how it works. That's why the poor hen works herself to death, feeding the greedy cuckoo chick. The existence of such a proclivity is important to the continuation of the species, on page 107. So again, they're talking about motherhood as this like biological necessity, and they're talking about it in an animal way opposed to a human way. Also, we have two men talking about a woman that motherhood has been thrust upon. He clearly doesn't have any feelings of obligation towards this child. We know that Farrellyn has a son. He calls the child it. It is a pronoun that we use for objects, not humans or human-like things, right? Like it is not generally a pronoun for things that we see kinship with, living things. And so he's perfectly fine to not take on the role of father, despite the fact that his wife is raising a child in their household. But she has this biological. But does she have this biological? This is the thing. What is biological and what is social? Because then we get to, I think, one of my favorite things that happens in the book, Dr. Margaret Haxby. So Dr. Margaret Haxby is the first woman to abandon her parasite child. So she gets impregnated, she quits her job, she leaves Midwich because she was working at the Grange as like a researcher. And the babies force all of the mothers to come back to Midwich so they can all be together. And she's like, fuck it, my career is more important. And so she leaves the baby, and then she calls Mrs. Zellaby on the committee, and she's like, I don't want to give up this, right? Like I have a career. She's a PhD, you know. She's one of the brightest academically, the text tells us. And she argues that she's no more responsible for the baby than if it had been left on her doorstep. And there is therefore no reason why she should put up with or be expected to put up with the wrecking of her life, her work, on account of the baby, on page 110. And then Zellaby's like, well, what about the law? Like, you can't just abandon a baby. And she, of course, because she's a doctor, she's brilliant, she thinks of this too. And she's like, medical evidence will establish that this child isn't hers. She can argue that it was placed in loco parentis without her knowledge or consent, and she cannot be held responsible. And then Zellaby's like, but what if others decide to follow Margaret Haxby's example? Like, what if this like social obligation that is providing care for 60 odd children just decides they don't want to do that anymore? Like, what will happen? Especially because these babies apparently have the power to cause pain with their minds if they feel that their comfort and well-being is no longer being met, right? Like he starts going like, oh no, like the thing that we were counting on holding this tower of cards together is not rooted. It's not working. It's not going to hold long term. And then he wonders about his daughter, and I think he acknowledges for us, like just in case we didn't get it, that there is, quote, so much social and traditional pressure on a woman in these things. One's self-defensive instinct is to conform to the approved pattern. Personal honesty takes time to assert itself, if it is ever allowed, on page 112. So the idea that people might begin to question this gender role is frightening. Then it doesn't turn out to be that big of a deal because the children are not integrating well into the human host families. And so the Grange is turned into a fancy boarding school for the children. And some of the children just make a complete break from host parents, host families that haven't worked well for them. And then some of them do have like an okay relationship with the mothers who are invested. But for those who did not want this role, who did not want this experience, the children just completely cut them off and are completely fine to not have a mother. So it ends up being a non-issue, but you know, it's worth it. It's worth it to point out the ways that we're invited to think about motherhood, and also sort of by its absence, fatherhood. Like we have no sense of what the men are doing, but you would think that if you are raising any child in your household, even if it's one that like looks a little different than you, that you would be treating it the same as any other children that might be in your household. So like, what are these fathers doing? Like, are they all referring to the Midwich Cuckoo children as it instead of with gendered pronouns that acknowledge their humanity? Like, we have a very, we have another silence. We have the absence of fathers, which I think speaks to, again, who is expected to do what. Because once the children are a little bit older, there's no need that the women who birth the children be their sole caregivers. So then we get into part 2 in the book. There is a big time jump. At this point, the Gayfords, Janet and Richard, have moved away. And Gayford ends up back in Midwich as our narrative point of view because he's visiting on a trip. And we learn that the children have a very different sense of community, that their ties to one another are more important to them than an ordinary human family. And because they're too different, they can't become one of the family. And we learn about that on page 131. And so we have this idea of the child collective introduced. We know that the children are so similar looking that the mothers cannot tell them apart. And then I think it's Celebi who does an experiment testing what the children know. He has like a little puzzle and he shows it to a couple of the boys and none of them can figure out how to do it. And then he shows it to one boy in isolation and then the boy does it. And then he takes it back to a bunch of boys and they all know how to do it. And he does the same with the girls. And he wonders to what extent any of these children are individual. And he's wondering if what we have here are actually two entities, a boy entity and a girl entity. And the boy is comprised of 30 parts. And the boy, or is it the other way around? The boy is composed of 4. Anyways, there are roughly 30 parts that make up a whole individual, or individuals, like 30 individuals that share a collective space. They don't really get any answers. It's just sort of something that's floating there. And I think it's interesting that these children are, spoiler, positioned as a human-like species that will beat out Homo sapiens because of how they learn, because of how they are collective, because of how they share knowledge, and also because they have like the psychic abilities to cause other things to kill themselves, which we'll get to in a minute with the murder of Jim Pauley. Like, on the one hand, I find the child collective aspect super interesting. The idea that a superior human-like race would be one that is of one mind, like quite literally, like on the same page, working for the same goal, sharing. They are looking out for each other, like the kids do look out for each other. And that at like the same side, you know how like utopia and dystopia, they're two sides of the same coin. How I think that we see the collective one mind reaction of the kids resulting in very extreme responses. So like individually, we see Zellaby, I think, work one-on-one with a child who allows him through the barrier for her walk because he can reason with her and be like, the collective might want us all to stay here, but you know that I go on this walk every day and I come back every day, and like my wife and life is here, I'm coming back. And so the individual can make that call, but like as a collective, as like a one mind, they make some pretty poor decisions. And it is almost always like, I don't know, reactionary, like it's rash, it's not thought out. Like the individual pieces sometimes seem to have the ability to think, but when they are one, they make bad choices. So yeah, two sides of the same coin. The utopia of like unity and also the dystopia of being of one mind. And I think we things escalate quickly. At the end of this book, the kids go from like exhibiting slightly horrifying tendencies. Like there's that incident of the mother who accidentally pokes her baby with a pin, and then the baby retaliates by having the mother drive the pin into her flesh over and over again as punishment. It's like not a tit for tat. Like it's not like a, oh, you caused me one pain, I cause you one pain. It's you caused me one pain, I will make sure you never, ever poke me with a pin ever again. Like we've seen a little bit of it. And again, I feel like we've talked about this before, that young people's brains aren't fully developed. And so they don't make the best decisions. They don't quite grasp cause and effect all the time. And children behave selfishly. It's something that we hopefully grow out of as we learn and we grow empathy. But kids are not empathetic. It's unfortunate, but they haven't learned that yet. And unfortunately, you now have incredibly smart children. So they look 9, but they're at like a it's something about they look 9, but 17 is where they seem to be mentally, but then because they're all sharing all of their knowledge, they have way more knowledge of philosophy and ethics and human social structure than any one 17-year-old probably has. And so, like, they become quite dangerous quite quickly. So Jim Polly accidentally clips one of the children with his car, which would be a horrifying and traumatic event. And the childish reaction is a flare of anger and revenge. And they kill him. They make him drive his car into a wall. And I think it's the professor that points out, like, oh, why didn't you just make him stop his car? Like, you could have done so many different things, but you had him kill himself. And then again, his brother, David, tries to avenge Jim's death because justice is not served. The children aren't punished for what everybody in town sort of knows is their fault, but can't really, like, in a human legal way, prove is their fault. Because how do you put like a mental compulsion on trial in a human context? They're found not guilty, and so the brother tries to take it into his own hands, and so he shoots one of the children from afar with a pellet gun, which I'm sure sucks. I'm sure it hurts, but the children take that and turn the gun around on him at close range and have him shoot himself. This causes most of the men in town to rebel. Basically, anybody who's not on that self-appointed committee, who's been sort of positioning themselves as higher, controlling this narrative, the men of the town, the ones who are living with the women who are probably not happy, they form a mob and they try and attack the Grange, the boarding school where the children are, and the children turn all of them against one another. It results in 4 dead people, 13 hospitalized people, and several people who aren't in the hospital but badly injured. And it ends up looking like a riot, like a random riot on the lawn in front of a children's school for no particular reason. And at that point, the children refuse to let anyone leave the village. And we find it is because the children are kind of using them as hostages to keep the military from blowing up the whole village. So this part of the book, with every escalation, I don't know how this read for folks, but maybe it's just because I am human, raised in like a human social context where we value human life and we misplace, but we do try and put our trust, perhaps naively, in the systems around us. There's like every time the children escalate something, I'm like, but why? Like, the world is big enough for different species. The world is big enough for different cultures, different ways of being. And the children escalating and choosing violence does not make a compelling argument for not killing them. And we end up with like these philosophical debates where the children have taken all of what they know about humans and ethics. And maybe this is fair given human history, but they're like, well, it's an eventuality. Like, eventually it is going to sink in that we are better than you, that we are smarter than you, that we will succeed at life better than you, and that humanity will go extinct. And instead of just like quietly living with that, like letting evolution take its course. And again, we have that with like the species, going back to the title, the cuckoos. There are species that co-evolve alongside brood parasites, and they adapt to live better, to preserve their own species, just through evolution, right? Like the evolution of spots on your egg so that it looks more unique, so that when the cuckoo lays its egg, you're like, oh, well, that one's not mine, and you can get rid of it, right? Like there's that co-evolving that happens in nature. The cuckoo children could have chosen a more passive way to dominance, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. And so Lydia's mentioned in the comments, it shows how little the children thought of humans, that they needed to teach humans a lesson. And I guess in some ways, if they are learning our history, fair. Like we have a history of humans being violent, of erasing that is not like that, which is not like us, right? Like this is 1950. We've just come off of World War II, where there was literally some humans trying to genocide away some other humans. Like, I guess it is not unreasonable for the children to react with violence towards a people that has been so violent, or a species, humans, who have been so violent. But then at the same time, they're like really not giving humans a chance. And perhaps because I'm a human, I feel like, gosh, we should be given a chance. But yeah. Oh, yes. We're going to get to, so Lydia has like, this is sort of like full spoilers now. The Russia thing, the multiple day outs. So we find out that there were multiple day outs. I am going to grab the actual page here because there were so many things that I wanted to pull up. I didn't want to type them all out. So I'm too far. There we go. So Bernard, the colonel, tells us that there were many day outs. And so he lists the places that there were day outs. So there is a small township in Northern Territory of Australia. Something apparently went badly wrong there. There were 33 pregnancies, but for some reason, all the children died. Most of them a few hours after birth, the eldest at a week old. Now, again, this is mediated information. The phrasing here makes it sound like this is a passive opposed to active thing. The children died opposed to the children were aborted or murdered. Then we get to, there was a day out at the Eskimo settlement on Victoria Island. Words. Let me start again. There was a day out at an Eskimo settlement on Victoria Island of northern Canada. First of all, Eskimo is a outdated racial term. You know, it's Inuit people. So we have Bernard go on to say the inhabitants are cagey about what happened there. It is believed that they were so outraged or perhaps alarmed at the arrival of babies so unlike their own kind that they exposed them almost at once. At any rate, none survived. I have a lot of problems with the racist implications here. So they like, inhabitants is a word. that is a word to choose to talk about Inuit people. I don't know what I have to look up like the etymology of inhabitant, but for some reason that word is sticking as like icky. The idea that the babies are unlike their own kind, it's not the babies didn't look human. It's that the babies didn't look Inuit. The babies didn't look like people of color. The own kind. It's not that the babies didn't look like us, acknowledging our shared humanity. It's again sort of othering Inuit people with the language here. And then, of course, it is the Inuit people who are uncivilized, and somehow all of their babies die. And that goes on to like the other places that we see. Anywhere basically that is not the civilized land where Midwich is, the UK, is like wacky and backwards and uncivilized. We get to Outer Mongolia, where it is assumed that the women had been lying with devils and they perished, as well as the children. They did not perish, they were murdered. But again, we have this, the language here is choice. It is choices. And again, all of the places that choose to prevent the continued existence of the children are not the Great Britain. They are not the hub of civilization that is being pictured here. And it's, I mean, it speaks to the colonial past, it's gross. I don't know. It basically anywhere where they killed babies, where they killed the children, is painted as uncivilized. And I'm not sure that is fair. Like, if we think about how different cultures have different social structures and have historically valued people of different genders differently. Inuit peoples before colonization did not have our patriarchal gender structures, our imposition, and men and women were valued equally. So perhaps this is not as like the implication of the text is like racist and gross, but perhaps this was possible to not have these parasitic danger children because the community of Inuit actually listened to the pregnant people and took action, Like, there are different ways of reading this, and I feel like, of course, it is the like British, English, I'm never sure of the difference, military man who has this racist language come out of his mouth. He basically tells us that everywhere else in the world, other than where we are, because we're so great, viewed the babies as, quote, freaks, and they were killed on page 190. Then, of course, as Lydia's mentioned in the chat, Russia was Russia. And they saw the children as a, quote, racial danger of a most urgent kind, end quote. They called upon all governments everywhere to neutralize any such known groups with the least possible delay. On page 191, they then bombed into oblivion Gizhnisk and all of the Russian humans in it. And again, we get into this idea of the British citizens are different and better is sort of the implication because they're individuals and they have rights. And Russia sees everybody as working for the state. So killing all these people to preserve the human race, like dying for the state, is a thing that the people will be okay with. Whereas you can't do that in civilized Britain because people are individuals and they have rights, and you can't just blow them up. And so the children know this, and they use it, and they start using the people of Midwich as a shield. Now, here's something that I would love to hear from folks. Do we believe that the small town of Midwich, the humans in the small town of Midwich, would be an effective shield? The children think that the structuring of British society and people having rights would prevent them from being bombed. I don't know if that's true. Like, we have a pretty long history as humans of being really fucking shitty to each other. Like, just react first, think later, military cover-ups in the name of safety. I don't know if in a setting just past World War II, would something that threatens the peace, that threatens humanity to such a degree, be worth leaving in the world, be worth the risk of leaving in the world to a post-World War II Britain? Yeah, so Lydia's sort of in agreement here that I think if push came to shove, the town of Midwich would not have been a shield for very long. Again, Wyndham invites us to think about how bleak being human is, and how how shitty we are. Okay, we also get a little bit of religious musing at the end of the book from Zellaby, which I thought was interesting and kind of felt a little bit out of place. So he starts talking about how there's this missing link between early humans and, actually, I don't know, like pre-Homo sapiens, early humanoid beings. That there's a missing link between them and Homo sapiens. And he starts musing about how, well, there must be something greater that's using the earth as this sort of like testing ground, and it makes some creature and it plops it down there, and it's like, well, let's see what happens. And the cuckoos, in this sort of like there must be something greater view of things, are just another thing from a greater power, like plopped down on the earth to just see what happens. He talks about how these are a new strain on page 204. I didn't have time to research this. I don't know if this is still true. Like, this is from the 1950s. I don't know if there has been advancements in science, in DNA testing, and how we pull things from fossilized remains, ancient remains, to see if skeletons that appear to be like a large, like physical gap might have had more differences and be that missing link if it still had flesh and skin on it. Like, I honestly don't know. I would be willing to speculate that modern science might have found more in between steps in our evolution, or perhaps that the steps were bigger than we think. So recently, just like a fun fact, I'm totally tangenting here, but so apparently I was reading about books found in human skin. And we now have the technology, like only recently, we have developed the technology to test the protein in leather to identify the specific animals. Before, people would look at it with their eyes and they'd be like, does this look like the hair follicle pattern of a pig or a deer or a rabbit or a people? And there was like some best guessing, but now we have the ability to like take a tiny piece of dried out treated flesh and like do some science and pull out proteins that say definitively what animal it is. And so, unfortunately, all great apes have the same proteins. So you cannot look at a book, like you can look at a book that pings this protein and say, this is the skin of a great ape. Chances are it's human skin because no one's really binding books in chimps or gorillas. Like, there's no history of binding books in chimps and gorillas. So it's probably human, but we can't 100% say for sure that it's not just any great ape. And if you think about how visibly different we look from great apes, could the missing link not exist? It just be a larger gap than we think? I don't know. I now have a rabbit hole to go down on to see if science between the 1950s and now has done anything to update this. But I liked this musing coming in at the end that Zellaby isn't quite willing to think of this as like a next phase for us as humans. Like, there's no, again, with DNA testing, we can see that some humans have more Neanderthal DNA than others, and that there was like a dying out of Neanderthals for Homo sapiens, but there's like a little bit of genetic mixing. Could humanity have evolved in some way? Like, there's this thing in this book that's not in the text that I'm never going to get, that leaves me thinking about the future of humanity at this point. Like, just seeing like the big jumps that are being made, seeing Zellaby thinking about greater powers and future life, and what that might look like, I thought was interesting. A little bit out of place also, given how I think largely bleak this is about humanity, and about what the future of human-like creatures might look like, because the children aren't exactly a great option. Okay, the ending. Did anyone see the ending coming? Because I genuinely, like, as the last pages of this book was unfolding, I was like, do they just sit here? Do they just accept their fate and acknowledge that because the children look human, it brings up too many like moral and ethical issues? Like, we can't eliminate them because we value life, we value sentience, we value creatures with feelings. We can't, in good conscience, kill them. So I was sort of expecting a very like non-ending, like just, and then life went on in Midwich. We have accepted our fate. Everybody's stuck here, and we're just gonna live out our days like this. And sucks to suck. Humanity's doomed. That was the ending I was expecting. We get a much flashier ending, which I think is interesting. So on 113, Zellaby talks about how cuckoos are very determined survivors, and they're so determined that there's really only one thing to be done with them once a nest is infected. And he says, I am, as you know, a humane man. I think I may even say a kindly man by disposition. As a further disadvantage, I'm a civilized man. Again, that civilized man, going back to like the Inuit people and like the implications of like other groups around the world that have chosen to eliminate the children. This is like the little racist red flag. He goes, I'm a civilized man. For these reasons, I shall not be able to bring myself to approve of what ought to be done. So like the poor hen thrush, we shall feed and nurture the monster and betray our own species. Odd, don't you think? We could drown a litter of kittens that is no sort of threat to us, but these creatures we will carefully rear on page 113. So he knows that they should be eliminated for the good of the species, which brings up like a whole other ball of yarn, a whole other mess that I don't really want to get into, because this video has enough dings that could get it demonetized and perhaps taken off YouTube to look at the eugenic potential here is something that I don't really want to get into. But the fact that he feels like as a human, it would be easy to drown a litter of kittens, something that looks different, something that has different sentience, has different emotional connections to people. He'd be fully willing to murder a bag of kittens, but because the cuckoo children, these parasite children, look human, they speak, they think, not entirely in human ways, but in a way that he as a fellow human, or I guess not as a fellow human, he as a human sees some of himself in, some humanity in. He is unwilling to murder them. And this is given to us on page 113. And he's like, well, the children haven't really done anything. Like, they have to give us enough evidence for like us to even think, to begin to think about this decision. And then he finds out he only has a little bit longer to live. He is sick and dying. And so he's built this relationship of trust, as close as these children have to any sort of human emotion, to any sort of bond. They at least look forward to his presence. They look forward to his movie nights and his lectures, and they are excited when he shows up with a car full of equipment for their movie night, and they help carry it all in the building. And then, surprise, he had a bomb in it, and he blows up the children and himself. the end. What? Like, I feel like in taking these notes and finding the quote on page 113, I feel like I should have seen it coming, but I fully did not expect him to do it, of all people. I was just absolutely like shocked. I was shocked. And I can't decide if I love it because there's something deeply horrific about the idea of humans being stuck and sort of being stuck in the systems that we have set up. The idea that we grant humans rights, and that by granting the children rights, even though they aren't human, that they've been granted human rights and thus a right to live and a right to not be murdered. And like they've done that all along, right? Like from the very beginning, where the systems were set up, pro-life systems were set up before the children got to be like 17-year-old reactive murderers. All along, they have been so pro-life. I feel like it would almost be fitting to have to then live with that structure that had been set up at the end of the novel. So I don't know if I like the ending. Did anyone like the ending? I would also, just as like a conspicuously absent, is the USA. So we see places that the Colonel sort of with his language implies are not as civilized as Britain. And the US is left out of that. I feel like that is another place where there's like a huge silence, and like this would have gone over so differently. If you think about how vast the landmass of the United States is, that would be plenty of space for a day out to occur. And then I don't know what it is about the States. Perhaps it's like the religious freedoms. But the US seems to be prone to new religions. And these new religions often go unchecked until people start doing really sketchy things like mass suicides or murders. And so I feel like in the US setting, I wonder if there would have been like a cult of children, if this would have become a religious thing, if they would have been seen as religious leaders. And that could have been interesting to see too. Like we very much see the children in Midwich as this burden, a thing that they don't really know what to do with, that they feel socially responsible for, but they don't really know what to do with that long term. And they're all a little bit frightened of them or nervous about them. I could see in the States like worship forming around, like if 70 women got pregnant in a small town, a small religious town in the States, you just need one wacky religious figure to be like, the new coming, the new religion, let me write a book, right? Like, again, so much potential, so much like spiraling has happened as I think about this. And I feel like this is probably old enough that it's fairly close to being in public domain. that somebody could do like a retelling. It could be really fun to see this picked up in a modern context, like Lydia has mentioned here, like an updated version, to pick this up as like a television series or something, and it's still so relevant. Like all of the things that we have here touching on like the big themes, the big issues, it's all still relevant, but to expand it a little bit more and to put it in different contexts, I think would be interesting. So yeah, overall, I think I really, really enjoyed this. Out of all of John Wyndham's works, I think this might be my favorite. I love that it's full of questions. It's full of ambiguity. And the one thing that I'm just disappointed with is that the ending is concrete. That these children die. Yeah. That's the so I've given this 4 out of 5 stars, and it's the ending that's the reason, because I almost wish it was more open-ended, just because so many aspects of this novel are open-ended, and I've been left to ask questions and to think about systems and the way we treat people and how we treat bodies, and how we raise families. So yeah, I had fun with this. Oh my gosh, my knee's locked up. Does anyone have any final thoughts about the Midwich Cuckoos? Anything to add? I'm gonna hydrate for a minute here. While I give folks a minute to think about that, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping before we go. So this is the last small book club book for 2022. December is super busy, so even though this has been happening every other month, we're gonna give everybody December to, I don't know, potato, relax, have fun, have fun with your families. There is one more patron exclusive live stream. We are wrapping up the Red Rum Book Club for the year with The Running Man by Stephen King on December 3rd. So if you are a patron, that is relevant to you. I kind of want to go through all of the books that we covered in the book club this year and like do a little summary video and kind of see if there were any overarching themes. I think we started this year with A Room of Her Own, if I'm not mistaken. So we're starting with early feminist nonfiction text, and we're ending with I don't know if we can call this a feminist text, but we can call this a text that really invites a feminist reading of it. So yeah, I'm thinking about playing with some of those themes and like what I've sort of taken away from this. So if you're watching on the live or on the replay, if you have any thoughts about this book or like overall the reading that we've done together, do feel free to leave it in the chat for me, leave it in the comments for me. Yeah, this has been fun. Thank you. Thank you for a year of book clubbing with me. Oh my gosh, we've been talking for 2 hours. I think I'm going to call it there. Thank you. Thank you, Lydia, for being here. Thank you, folks, for dropping in and for chatting. This has been a lot of fun. Yeah, I hope that everybody has a good day, and I will see you soon. Bye.